Just a few more seconds. All right. Looks like we're getting there with numbers. Fantastic. Well, listen, let's crack on. We've got lots to discuss today. Welcome to today's webinar for the use cases of the ASCOR tool, which stands for Assessing Sovereign Climate-Related Opportunities and Risks, but that's a mouthful, so we call it the ASCOR project. And today it is being hosted by the Transition Pathway Initiative Centre, based out of the London School of Economics, which is the academic partner for the ASCOR project. My name is Victoria Barron, so if we haven't met before, hello. And I am one of the ASCOR co-chairs. And this is a second webinar that we are hosting after one that we held earlier on in the year in February. So perhaps we can move on to the agenda slide. Lovely. So this is the agenda for our conversation today. As I said, I'm Victoria, but Carmen Nuzo, the Executive Director of the TPI Centre at LSE, will be providing a summary after me of the structure of the ASCOR framework, which underpins the country assessments, and an update on where the project has gotten to so far. She'll also be chairing the rest of today's session. After her, we'll be hearing firsthand from the users of ASCOR and find out of practical uses that these panelists are having and undertaking. And we will be joined by some really fantastic people today. We'll first hear from Matthew Graves, who is a sovereign research analyst focusing on emerging markets at Western Asset Management, and he will be giving us the investor view of how he is using ASCOR. Next up, then, it will be Tom Arup, who is the Senior Specialist Stewardship under Sovereign Climate Engagement at the Principles of Responsible Investment. Now, Tom's going to be telling us about a really interesting initiative and collaborative engagement process that's occurring with investors in Australia, being supported by the PRI, and how they are using ASCOR as part of that collaborative engagement. We are very honoured to be joined by Víctor González Corvalán today, who is the head of the Debt Management Office, Ministry of Finance in Chile, who will be bringing the sovereign issuer perspective, which we are very grateful for. And last but certainly not least is the wonderful Barbara Oldani, who is lead on stakeholder engagement at the Sustainability-Linked Sovereign Debt Hub, who's going to talk about the ASCOR indicators and how they might be useful to support labelled sovereign bonds, but also sustainability-linked bonds in particular. And also there's an opportunity for you to pose questions throughout this session and also at the end of the webinar. So please do use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask us, and don't be shy. This is an interactive webinar. Final reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Grantham Research Institute website as well as the TPI Centre. But of course, this is always technology permitting, so we will be trying our best. Right, so what is ASCOR? You probably know, so I'm not going to spend too long on it, but ASCOR is an investor-led project trying to create, and that has created an investor tool, which can be used for investment purposes, to assess countries on their progress managing the low carbon transition and the impacts of climate change. Now, the methodology and results will be covered by our colleagues very shortly, but if you want more detail, please do head to transitionpathwayinitiative.org/ASCOR. And the organisations behind ASCOR are those that you see on the right. We've got international investors and initiatives representing over 5 trillion AUM, because there is that need for assessment of sovereign debt when it comes to climate change. And those are some fantastic organisations that we've seen globally, also supported by the investor networks working on climate change, and of course our academic partners, LSE and TPI. If you want more details, please also head to www.ascorproject.org if you want the background as to where ASCOR has come from. But I'm going to stop here and hand over to Carmen, who will take you through the really interesting stuff. But thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And before I hand over the floor to our esteemed panelists, I would like to take the opportunity to just go over the pillars underpinning the ASCOR framework very quickly. I will cover them briefly because, as Victoria said, there are the resources in the chat. You can refer to our websites for more details. But in a nutshell, ASCOR comprises 3 main pillars, and within each pillar, there are different areas. So pillar 1, can you still see the slides? Yeah, perfect. Okay, great. Pillar 1 is within each pillar, there are 3 different areas. Pillar 1 has got emission pathways, both historical trends and forward-looking targets. In Pillar 2, we focus on climate policies covering mitigation, adaptation, and just transition policies. And Pillar 3 covers indicators that we've grouped under the heading of climate finance, which comprises different indicators, including, for example, the transparency in climate costing that governments put in place related to their transition plans or adaptation plans, or climate spending. For example, we look at whether a government has started to introduce the practice of budget tagging. Each area is filled in by binary yes and no indicators and metrics, and sometimes only quantitative metrics. What I want to stress is that importantly, we do not provide an aggregated single score for ASCOR, and this is to give a nuanced picture of how countries are tackling climate change and also avoid a ranking of countries based on a single metric that would not take into account adequately the different income brackets and development differences among the different sovereigns. Finally, all assessments are exclusively based on publicly available information for 2 reasons. One, we want to encourage transparency, and you can find all the sources that we use on the website, but also we did not want to add to the sovereign reporting burden. And an additional distinct, I would say, feature of the ASCOR framework is that it's also based on the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, what is very often referred to in simple terms as fairness principle. This is a principle enshrined in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, as well as in the Paris Agreement. And effectively, although all countries should take responsibilities for tackling climate change, this should be differentiated and take into account the responsibilities for past emissions that may have contributed to climate change, and also different levels of income, as I've just mentioned. So the way we put this in practice is that through income group exemptions. So we have high income countries assessed all the indicators. Middle income countries are exempt from the high ambition indicators, and the low income countries are exempt from the mitigation policy areas. And lastly, we also just focus on how countries manage climate risk. In other words, we do not focus on characteristics that would fail outside the realm of decision-making by governments, such as climate hazard. So let me go through the next slide. So in this map, you will see the countries that we have covered in the first round of assessment that we've conducted last year. We published an initial assessment for 25 countries. You see them colored in blue in the map. They cover about 70% of global emissions and 50 to 80% of the main sovereign bond indices. In the ongoing assessment phase, we will increase the coverage to 70 countries. The assessments will be released around year-end. You see them marked in green on the map. And as you will notice, there will be a considerable expansion to countries in emerging market economies. And finally, my last point is, before we go to the heart of today's webinar, is that you will surely be hearing directly from the users of ASCOR about its applicability and usefulness. However, I do want to emphasize that as much as the framework was initiated to meet investor demand, the framework is also very much for sovereign issuers as well, because they can showcase their progress on climate action and also use it to inform their engagement with investors. So we're therefore very honored, as Victoria has already mentioned, to have Víctor with us today as the head of the Debt Management Office of Chile. He has accepted our invitation, and this is a true testament to the willingness to be transparent and also to engage with external stakeholders. And we're grateful also to all the sovereigns who have engaged with us in the public consultation, and the representatives of Germany and Uruguay who participated in the inaugural ASCOR webinar that we hosted in February of this year. So this is why you see on this slide use cases for both the investors and the sovereigns. And on the issuer side, in addition to showcasing progress, ASCOR can also facilitate peer group comparison, adjusted for the right income brackets, of course, as well as facilitating internal conversations amongst different lines of ministries within a government and the civil sector that might be responsible for different aspects of tackling climate change. And finally, when it comes to the use of that investors may make, one last point I would like to emphasize is that ASCOR is not a risk measuring tool. And whilst it was conceived to help sovereign bondholders in the first place to frame climate change in their sovereign debt analysis and inform dialogues with sovereigns and help them with the regulatory reporting, it is also applicable to any investor who might invest in corporates operating in a certain jurisdiction or in a country to frame the country risk around that. Lastly, the final use case that we've come across that appears to be very useful as we've conducted a number of roundtables with sovereigns and investors, and has been mentioned a few times, is also the degree to which it can help investors align with the net zero investment framework, for example, by the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change, who just released version 2 a few days ago of the framework. So with that, I'm now handing over to Matt Graves, who's Sovereign Research Analyst focused on emerging markets at Western Asset Management. Matt is among the investors who have supported ASCOR from the very beginning because he was in need of it, and so he's actively using it, and he will show you in a few minutes how he's been starting to incorporate ASCOR's results in his analysis and assessments. Thank you. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Carmen. Really happy to have the opportunity to be here today and to present alongside such a wonderful group of panelists. So I wanted to start with one kind of bigger picture point. As Carmen mentioned, my background is in emerging markets research and portfolio management. And I think the biggest thing from my side as a research analyst and when we are managing portfolios is we need to understand sustainability characteristics of issuers and issuances at the time of investment, right? So those data need to be readily accessible. We need to be able to do it kind of in real time. And so something like ASCOR, which takes what I would sort of broadly describe as, multiple independent sort of sometimes unstructured data sets, and it really brings it together in a coherent way. And that's incredibly helpful. And I think particularly because not everyone that is investing in sovereign debt is an ESG specialist. And so the way that ASCOR presents information in a really clear and easy to digest type of way, it creates a multiplier effect in terms of the number of investors, I think, that can incorporate sustainability into their investment framework. And so ASCOR really helps make sovereign sustainable finance something that's accessible to a broader audience. So how do we use this tool? And I think there are three major themes that it helps us cover, which I'd broadly categorize as emissions, engagement, and entity level assessments. So what do I mean by emissions? Well, ASCOR allows us to build a view on a country's emissions trends and recent performance in a pretty quick way. And the important part of that, I think, is that emissions is actually like a fairly nuanced area, right? So we want to be able to look at trends on an absolute basis. That goes without saying, but it's also important to look on a per capita and GDP adjusted basis, right? And that gets into some of the principles that Carmen talked about, that there need to be differentiated responsibilities for the way that we manage the transition. And so the relative importance of each of those measures depends a lot on the country context. And I'm going to use Kenya as an example. So I'll try to share my screen here. And let's see, make sure. Okay. Does that, looks like that came through okay.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you, Matt.
If we look at Kenya as an example, we can click into the emissions trend here. And you can see on an absolute basis, the 5-year trend is increasing. And so it flags as a miss here. But what I really like about this tool is that it allows you to go in and dig in a very quick way. So if you look at the 3-year trend and even the year-on-year trend relative to 2022, you can see that the trend is increasing, but the trend on the trend is actually declining. So the emissions levels are decelerating over time, and that's really important. I think the second piece that's important to observe here is that we can look at emissions intensity per capita. So Kenya, it may not be obvious just by looking at that number, and we'll put it in context in just a second, but that's a very, very low level of emissions per capita. And you can see even relative to GDP that the emissions intensity has been declining over time. So there are a number of kind of dimensions to this analysis that I think are important and that ASCOR lets us observe in a very quick way. So if we come over to the second slide or second screen here, and this is on the main screen for ASCOR, you can see I'm going to add Kenya into this mix. And you can see that from a sort of an absolute basis, Kenya is not emitting much. And if we look at this again as a per capita, on a per capita basis, you can see relative to these peers, which aren't necessarily Kenya's income level peers, emissions are quite low. And even if you add in a country like India, Kenya's overall emissions are still quite low on a per capita basis. The final piece here is looking at the emissions intensity relative to GDP. And we can see on this basis, Kenya actually comes in relatively high versus a DM peer group. But if you were to go in and add a bunch of EM countries in there, it looks much better. And so that's just a structural feature of a lot of emerging economies, that the emissions intensity is going to be more elevated. So I'm going to stop sharing briefly. So that's a really important, I think, there's a lot of context in that assessment. That's important because it informs the way we're going to think about the emissions trajectory. And I think you can see that there are positives to Kenya's emissions performance. There are some things where maybe we would like to see more improvement. And those data points and kind of that context is really important as we move into the second theme, which is engagement. So if we build a bit on the emissions discussion, the overview is important because it really informs the way we end up thinking about engagement with countries. In the case of Kenya, it wouldn't make sense to start a climate change mitigation discussion with a focus on absolute emission levels. And in fact, I think that might actually be pretty counterproductive. I don't think that would be received well. Kenya's hardly contributed to global GHG emissions, and that's a narrative we hear frequently, right? We hear that from global South countries, but you can see in the data, there's a lot of validity behind that. So for those reasons, a discussion on emissions with Kenya really needs to start with a focus on development. And the emissions trajectory isn't the issue there. It's really how do we support Kenyan economic development, and how do we sort of do it in a way that encourages sustainable energy policies over time, so that the emissions intensity relative to GDP is coming down over time and doesn't become a constraint to growth or to capital flows as sovereign sustainable finance sort of increasingly grows in importance. The final piece here, which is pillar 2 that was in Carmen's slides, has to do with entity level commitment and credibility. And this is really critical for labeled bonds. So it's incredibly important to make an issuer level assessment, even when you have a green or sustainable bond, because the use of proceeds, while it is theoretically restricted, the ability to monitor and enforce those restrictions is sometimes limited. And so it's the entity level commitment that you see in a country like Chile or in a country like Uruguay is really important to having confidence in the underlying instrument. That's even more true when you think about a bond like a sustainability linked bond, which Barbara will cover in depth, where you don't have a restriction on the use of proceeds. And so the policies pillar within ASCOR gives us a lot of really good information to help judge an issuer's credibility and commitment to climate. And we really like to see framework climate laws implemented in practice as a way to center the energy transition and good climate policies as a part of that country's economic program and as a part of their plan for economic development. And so when we're able to click through and see all of this information, again, in a way that's really digestible, that's really accessible, and that's really easy to understand, it adds a huge amount of context and really rich information to the sovereign credit evaluation process. So kind of very quickly, that's how we use the tool. There are a lot more ways that you can use it, but those are a few of the highlights, and certainly happy to answer questions if any come up.
Great, thank you, Matt. Thank you very much. I really like the fact that you've started to use ASCOR to inform conversations, but in a constructive spirit. To the point that you made about Kenya is not so much the track record, but how can you as investors support the development and the growth of Kenya compatibly with the missions that might be required and associated with that, and also the point that you made about contextualizing and putting in a broader perspective the strategy of a country, as well as looking at just the individual issuance, is quite important. So with that, I'm going to hand the floor to Tom Arup, who's Senior Specialist Stewardship at in the Department of Sovereign Climate Engagement at the Principles for Responsible Investment. Tom will tell us more about how ASCOR is being used in a collaborative engagement initiative by investors in Australia, which the PRI has been supporting. Tom, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Carmen. And yeah, I won't repeat my rather silly 6-word title, but in short, I'm leading our sort of nascent collaborative sovereign engagement work. At the PRI. So just before I dive into a little bit of what the engagement is and then how ASCOR has contributed to that, I just want to flag 2 things at the top. One, I have to be reasonably sensitive about the conversations that I had within the engagements. And secondly, I don't speak on behalf of the investors who are acting in the engagement. So if at times I'm sounding rather general, it's just because I'm working within those barriers. So in September 2022, the PRI launched a pilot engagement focused on the Australian system. It did that against the backdrop of organic sovereign engagement that was occurring by our signatories on ESG issues, and Matt's, I guess, demonstrated how that's happening at an individual signatory level. We were starting to see reports from the World Bank, from debt management officers by the World Bank, that debt management officers were getting increasing questions about ESG issues on roadshows. And we saw some initial collaboration attempts in terms of engagement that many are still running, including the Investor Policy Dialogue on Deforestation that launched in 2020. We were approached by a handful of signatories asking for support in collaborating on engagement with sovereigns on climate change. PRI agreed to launch a pilot because this is nascent practice, and the collaboration is still relatively new practice in this space. Australia was chosen as the pilot market for a range of reasons, related partly to its climate performance and how it showed up on a number of the investors' sovereign ESG metrics, risk metrics, particularly in the E space. But secondly, it's a large issuer, and a lot of global investors hold Australian debt or hold significant exposure to the market through other asset classes. We started the engagement with 7 signatories, so a very small caps group. And while we're just to note in this context, while we're asset class forward, so sovereign bond or the sovereign debt is a primary framing for the engagement. The engagement is inclusive also of investors who are interested in sovereign performance and climate change because of the enabling environment it might create for other assets that they hold, such as listed equities, or through their exposure as a universal owner to a failure to transition along the agreement, the Paris Agreement temperature goals, and recognizing that sovereigns hold very powerful economic levers to drive that transition. As I said, we started with 7 signatories in the engagement. Due to signatory demand and what we saw as progress in the engagement, midway through last year, we expanded that group out to 25 signatories, and we have a waiting list of kind of similar to join. They represented $8 trillion US in assets under management, and they come from across the globe. So there's European, US, Australian, and Asian investors participating in the engagement. We describe this engagement as deep engagement. So that means while there's engagement with the Debt Management Office, we're actually engaging with a large number of sovereign related entities across the Australian system. So we've engaged over the almost 2 years that the engagement's been running with about 25 government departments, regulators, both at the national and sub-sovereign level. So you can see it's quite a wide universe of engagement targets, and it's an interest and I guess a cross-market interest in the response to climate change and climate risk. The objective of the engagement is collaborative and supportive. So investors want to help governments with their transition, recognizing that we're all working our way through a transition, and both sides are navigating what is a very complicated policy response and capital market response. And there are some kind of headline focus areas, predominantly related to emissions trajectory, and trying to see that bend towards the Paris-aligned trajectories, the establishment of credible plans, targets, budget allocation in the market to drive the transition, increased measures to improve the adaptive capacity and physical risk resilience of the market, and also sovereign disclosure of climate risk. And that's particularly important for those with a sovereign bond focus. There's an update report. We just published an update report on the engagement on the PRI website on Friday. So if you're interested in more detail, including some of the engagement topics, please seek that out. But I'll just sort of turn quickly to how ASCOR has been integrated. So the timeline, as you can tell, was that the engagement was launched before ASCOR was launched into the market. So we were operating for about a year before the first assessments were published. But even in that period, ASCOR was useful because a lot of the engagement is two-way, and in good faith, investors are trying to bring to the market and help policymakers understand their processes for working through sovereign risk and how that might affect investment decisions. And sometimes that can be relatively black box for a policymaker. A number of the investors we use have their own proprietary models for doing that. And ASCOR was a useful demonstration and example for the market of how practice was evolving and the types of metrics and the types of processes investors were starting to integrate into their investment decisions. As ASCOR published and as we got deeper into the engagement, ASCOR has played a role in the engagement itself. Again, can't go too much to the detail of the sort of discussions in the engagement, but some of the areas where ASCOR is useful in sovereign engagement, from our perspective, and where we've seen some practice in the pilot, is helping to identify potential policy gaps, policy trends, or areas of potential risk where you may want to focus your attention in an engagement. So climate change is a complicated, multi-system issue. Engagement with sovereigns can be quite wide and dense. So it's a way of trying to identify the areas of most immediate interest. Secondly, it helps with asking questions in engagement meetings. So it helps inform investors to bring, actually ask informative and useful questions in the engagement meetings. And we, in the collaboration, because it's a collaboration space, we do spend a bit of time thinking through what our priority focus topics are for the engagement each year. And we try to tag ASCOR as one measure against that. And we do that so that we ensure that the focus topics are connected to the materiality for investors, but also it's a way to help us in the future track progress against those topics. Looking forward, so the Australian engagement is both a genuine engagement in terms of the Australian climate response, but also from a PRI perspective, it is an attempt to understand what role collaboration could play in sovereign engagement, and whether there is a model that will be useful for both investors and sovereigns in, again, navigating this transition. So if I forecast to how ASCOR would play a role in a multi-market initiative, if and when we started to engage with more markets through this type of model. So first, we can see ASCOR will play a role in determining which markets to focus on. So in a resource-constrained environment, particularly in a collaboration space where a lot of resources go into helping bring investors together for these types of discussions, we need a credible framework to choose markets, and ASCOR is going to contribute to that. And then just finally, understanding the impact and the direction of the market as the engagement progresses. Again, as we get years and years of ASCOR assessments, we will get more data to understand how the market's progressing and try to understand market progress and also potentially engagement impact. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, Carmen.
Thank you, Tom. I really, so complex, if I hear you correctly, complex but possible. It takes a lot of work, but it's actually paying off. And I really like the point that you made about focusing on gaps, but at the same time bringing clarity by asking the right questions and prioritizing topics, because not everything can be solved at the same time. So also picking the topics that you want to attach more attention to and monitoring them. It's really, really important. And for those of you who are interested in the report that the PRI has just published, in addition to looking at the website, my colleague Alex has very kindly posted it in the chat box as well. So Victor, over to you. Victor is the head of the Data Management Office at the Ministry of Finance in Chile. He brings the sovereign issuer perspective to the panel. Chile has a set of public policies supporting the low carbon transition and has been really at the forefront ahead of many other countries in showing commitments towards climate change mitigation and environment protection. And importantly, this has happened through various administrations. So Victor, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation, Carmen. So my idea here is to share the recent history of the Chilean ESG issuances to show how it relates to the ASCOR initiative, as well as how ASCOR could be useful as a tool in this regard. So during the last year, Chile has developed a great interest to integrate its effort to face climate change into its financial strategy. So thus in 2019, Chile decided to issue its first green bond, mainly oriented to the green sector, typically including the green strategy. So in Chile, the case is mainly electromobility and clean transportation. And on the other side, we have projects related to non-conventional renewable energy. So it's not news that the green bonds were mainly related to those projects. And we issued that bond in 2019, but once the first green bond was already issued, we discovered year per year a special trend in the investor perspective. And very interestingly, we received from the investor more sophisticated questions related not only to the instrument itself, but to the general ESG story of the country. And many times, for example, the questions received were not necessarily related to the projects that we were being financing through the bonds. And the question could be, for example, in the case of Chile, related to the mining sector, the impact on the environment related to the projects, the relation with the indigenous communities, with the community in general when implementing the project, and so on. So taking that into consideration, we consider necessary to expand the pure green approach to a more comprehensive view regarding the ESG topics. And 2 years after, we expanded the ESG framework, allowing the possibility to issue also social bonds and sustainable bonds in order to complement the general story of the country, aligning the different efforts made by the different ministries into a single instrument. Yeah? And after issuing the typical use of proceeds bonds, I mean the green and the social bonds, we started looking at the SLB possibilities, the SLB market. And in the case of the SLB bonds, they seem attractive mainly because of 2 reasons in our case. The first reason was that the possibility that give the SLB bonds to align the internal objectives into a single KPI, not replacing necessarily the typical green bond, but complementing the typical use of proceeds approach. And secondly, the SLB had the ability to strengthen the internal efforts that normally do not mean additional expenditure, and thus typically would not be included into a green bond. But obviously, it doesn't mean that we are not doing effort. Sometimes they are not related expenditures, but there are a lot of efforts. A typical example in this sector is in Chile, for example, the energy sector, in which the investment is purely private, but it doesn't mean that the government is not doing things in order to provide facilities to the private community in order to invest into the non-conventional renewable energy. So if we could summarize the two important aspects related the SLB and the use of proceeds bonds, I would say that the core of the Chilean experience related to the ESG issuances was first the importance of transmitting not only a single instrument, but a general ESG story, and to reflect that ESG story through some bonds, rather than focusing, so for example, in some specific instruments, it's more important to tell, first of all, the general story, the general strategy, and then to reflect that strategy into some instruments. And secondly, very important is to show that the effort implies concrete results. That there are concrete results that are part of a broader strategy, as mentioned, and that the strategy could be considered ambitious in a general context. So in this regard, why platforms such as the ASCOR tool could be useful in this context? I think that first of all, ASCOR helps to frame the internal efforts into a more comprehensive picture. And we change the focus from a single instrument to a general ESG story of the country. And in this regard, as Carmen very well explained, it could be an important piece to make a self-assessment first, and then to compare the internal efforts to what the other countries are doing in this regard. When we issued the SLB, we had to decide what kind of KPI we want to include, what will be the target related with the KPI. And a big question related to the KPI or the target is if it's relevant or if it's ambitious. So this could be only responded by comparison to other countries. Secondly, related to the benefits of the ASCOR projects and similar initiatives, that the green expenditure and the use of profit bonds sometimes are restricted to certain specific sectors, which highlights the necessity of a general overview. One big example is that normally when we issue the use of proceeds bonds, we need a second party opinion. And typically the second party opinion providers are mainly oriented mainly oriented more to mitigation than to adaptation process. So for example, we have done a lot of efforts regarding adaptation, but it could not be included in the typical green bond. At least with most of the SPO providers. In the case of the SLB, there is no much history in this regard, so it could be innovative. So we will be the first to do it, but yeah, it could be complicated to be the first in such a way. So in summary, I would say that ASCOR provides benchmarking and self-assessment, which is critical when issuing ESG bond, especially in the case of the SLB. Finally, I would like to give some brief words related to the Chile's assessment in ASCOR. So with the exception of the fossil fuel topic, Chile is very well positioned in relation to the climate policies. The country has made a lot of efforts, and nowadays, for example, we can see in each ministry a department or at least a couple of people that is in charge of climate topics. But certainly there are still challenges related to the climate costing, the transparency of the information, and specifically related to the cost of implementing the climate effort. So in this regard, Chile is working on that, and we recognize the importance not only of showing that we are doing efforts, but to incorporate them into this comprehensive analysis and to include numbers in that analysis, and obviously to include how the ESG issuances and the financial instrument are related to that general strategy. So obviously there are much details in this regard, but this is the general story. And if you have certain questions regarding more details.
Thank you so much, Victor. We really appreciate your honesty also about the assessment of Chile. Definitely, the climate finance pillar is the newest and perhaps the most challenging at the moment. And that's where we would encourage sovereigns also to focus their efforts, because this is the type of information that investors need to then assess the sustainability of the fiscal paths of the sovereigns that they invest in. But really important that you said that the issuances should not just be related to use of proceeds bonds, which are helpful, incredibly helpful, at least to start focusing the attention of both investors and sovereigns on climate change, but that zooming out, eventually the strategy is what's important and what drives the direction of travel, if you will, of a sovereign. Thank you for that. Barbara, over to you. Barbara is lead on the stakeholders engagement at the Sustainability-Linked Sovereign Debt Hub. She will talk about how ASCOR indicators could be helpful to support labeled sovereign bonds, and in particular sustainability-linked bonds, whose issuance has gone a bit dormant recently, but partly because we've been in a tightening cycle, but also because of what Victor perhaps mentioned, that you need ambitious and strong, credible KPIs, key performance indicators, to make this instrument work. So Barbara, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carmen and TPI, for inviting me to this panel. As you mentioned, the topic is extremely relevant for our work at the Sustainability Linked Sovereign Debt Hub, where I lead the stakeholder engagement and where we work to support an organic growth and scaling up of the SLB market for sovereigns. As mentioned, there have been only 2 countries, namely Chile, that has been pioneer and champion in this market, and then Uruguay. However, sovereign SLB can be powerful tools for countries to implement their climate mitigation and adaptation policies for the reasons we have heard from the investors, like Matt mentioned, and from Victor previously. Therefore, it would be great to see a lot more issuance of this kind, and it would be great for ASCOR to be instrumental to this purpose. An SLB basically embeds a sustainability commitment, or more than one, in the form of metrics, key performance indicator derived from a national policy commitment or an international commitment. And the challenges encountered when speaking to DMOs and investors alike is the need for, and we heard it from Victor, measurable and relevant KPIs, and ambitious sustainability performance targets, and for the standardization of reporting of these metrics. As much as we have a plethora of guidance and standards for corporate issuance, there are currently very few tools available for assessing and selecting sovereign KPIs and reporting. If we look at the International Capital Market Association principles, which the ICMA are considered the mainstream guidance among market players when issuing SLBs, they were enhanced last year to include specific sovereign issuer reference. And the KPIs need to be relevant core and material to the ESG policies and sustainability developmental policy for sovereigns. They need to be measurable or quantifiable on a consistent methodological basis. They need to be externally verifiable and benchmarkable. ICMA also suggests that they should select KPIs that they have already included in certain previous reporting. So, for example, in the NDCs or in the national adaptation plans, national biodiversity strategies. And the last thing is that ICMA suggests that the SPT reporting should be based on science-based KPIs. So when I started hearing about the ASCOR project, and a lot of investors I speak to were very excited about the idea and involved, as well as the PRI and Carmen, it was very exciting because it meant a potential huge step forward for the development of sovereign SLB market. So ASCOR could be a possible tool set for the choice and reporting of sovereign KPIs, something that's really been missing so far. The methodology seems to have all the requirements that we have listed now by the ICMA principles, plus the plan that Carmen mentioned to expand it to cover over 70 countries and then maybe even 100 the next year down the line with annual updates, really makes ASCOR a methodology that could be very promising to become mainstream for sovereign KPI selection and reporting. So that's overall, but then let's have a look at the specific example as much as I can, because I'm not extremely analytical. But anyway, I had a look at the ASCOR methodology, and I had a look at the adaptation to follow up on Victor's comments that we haven't seen many adaptation bonds coming out. The relevance of adaptation has been recently recognized also by ICMA. Last year, we as a hub worked on updating the KPI registry for sovereign at ICMA, and we added specific adaptation metrics for sovereigns. One of them is on climate change adaptation is the percentage of budget or actual expenditure for adaptation measures. So I thought, okay, let's have a look at the ASCOR methodology and see whether we can align what ASCOR is offering with the ICMA requirements. First of all, I had a look at the CP5, the Climate Policies Pillar 5, which is on adaptation. And as currently designed, consists of 5 questions that require a binary answer. So has the country published the National Adaptation Plan? Does it regularly publish National Climate Risk Assessment? Has there been a monitoring and evaluation report on implementation? Do they have multi-hazard early warning systems, and are they part of a sovereign catastrophe risk pool? So as much as CP5 is certainly a necessary basis to check the existence of a national adaptation policy and the implementation plans, however, binary KPIs are not considered effective in terms of the ICMA guidance. Still, if we go then to the climate finance pillar that Carmen mentioned before, there are based on costing and expenditure. So for example, the CF2 and the CF2B in particular looks into national adaptation plans, including a breakdown of estimated costs of implementing the measures identified in the plan. And the CF3A, it's about disclosing the climate-related expenditures in a systematic way, such as the disclosure contains the total amount and breakdown of the amount allocated to different categories, including mitigation, adaptation, etc. And on top of that, it asks for it to come from a publicly available source. So it seems to me that here there are real bases for the ASCOR climate finance pillar that is currently mostly focusing on transparency, but to be further looked into and maybe aligned to be expressed effectively as quantitative adaptation KPIs. And therefore, I would, I mean, I can close here, but I think this is a very good case study of what could be developed as a specific API aligned with the ICMA principles and hopefully base for much more SLB issuers for sovereigns. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Barbara, for all this feedback. Obviously, ASCOR is at the very beginning of its life. It took 2 years to make it, but it's in its first iterations, and we will take on board all this feedback to make it even more usable and more effective. We have about 10 minutes to address your questions now from the audience, and I would like Alex to perhaps bring all the speakers back on screen so they are visible. Thank you so much for the 2 people that have already started submitting questions. Please continue to do so. There is a first question by Ben St. Laurent, who is associate at MSCI. He's asking, does the ASCOR framework plan to include other factors about carbon credits beyond the use of credits to meet 2030 targets, i.e. the type of credits used, integrity considerations, and whether a country plans to increase its climate ambition through selling carbon credits rather than as a buyer? So we actually looked at this topic when we were putting together ASCOR, but we were not able to set out a robust assessment approach given the lack of best practice in the carbon markets. Also, as you can imagine, we needed to focus on indicators that were comparable for the benchmarking purpose that we had in mind. And so given the limited lack of evidence in this space, we were not able to incorporate this in the framework. This doesn't mean that we cannot do it going forward as part of this improvement that we will probably implement at some point. And in particular, we're monitoring Article 6 in this respect, the discussion set around how to shape clearer guidance for countries, and future iterations of ASCOR, as I said, may incorporate this if there is sufficient core data releases to allow for us to do that. And then there is a second question that has been asked by Nirmal Singh. Thank you for the question, Nirma. She's asking, she's asking about the metrics or the scores that underpin the various areas and pillars of the ASCOR framework. And if you dig deeper and download the data, you'll find that they're both. They're more qualitative indicators than actual metrics, but this is also down again to governments to start producing these metrics and make the indicators more quantifiable, to the point that Barbara has also just made. This will be extremely important to continue to develop, the SLB market. So there is one more question that has just popped up. Give me a second. So Jörg Sörns is asking, what is the expectation around the availability of production-based emissions for sovereigns? I don't know, Matt, would you like to address this perhaps?
Sure. I mean, I think we have those data, are probably more frequent and kind of more available than something like consumption-based emissions. So I think we broadly feel relatively good about where production-based emissions are at. Obviously, there are data lags with most of the data that we need to look at sovereigns and kind of the way they perform on climate. So working around that is a challenge, and I think hopefully over time we start to see the data produced more frequently, more accurately, and with fewer or shorter lags. And I think that's possible as technology improves, and hopefully as sovereigns start to focus a little bit more on how they report. But overall, I think the emission side is probably one of the areas where we have more and better data relative to some other areas of climate and environment.
Yeah. Actually, in the meantime, you're correct to this question. He was addressing, he was referring to consumption-based emissions, but you've addressed the questions. Nevertheless, I think we need both, and actually, the gap between the two really shows the extent to which maybe some countries are making progress on decarbonization, but they're outsourcing part of the emissions to other countries. So that's perhaps also another area to monitor. We have another question by somebody who hasn't revealed his or her name, and so the question says, do investors use the ASCOR data to aggregate a total country score, even though ASCOR does not provide that? So we do not advise how to use ASCOR. Investors and any other stakeholders looking at ASCORs are free to slice and dice the data the way they want. Academically, we didn't want to come up with a single score or ranking, but not to avoid the risk of ranking and to avoid investors drawing the wrong conclusions if they're not careful to allow for the differences related to the income brackets of the countries or the various phases of development. But by all means, with those caveats in mind that we've made very clear in the methodology note and also in the report accompanying the assessment results, investors are free to use ASCOR in the way they want. And then I guess the same person asked, could you cover the expected expansion plan for ASCOR, please? Yes. So as I said, we will expand the number of countries from 25 to 70 this year. The plan is to go just over 100, and by then we will have covered all the countries that are part of the major sovereign bond indices, be them global or for the emerging markets. And obviously after that, we probably stop in terms of coverage, because those are the most useful for the index investors, and this is demand that we have received, but also we are subject to funding, so it depends on that aspect as well. Now let's see if there are more there are more now. The questions keep coming. Is there high engagement with TPI and countries during the assessment? Okay, so the TPI is one of the investor networks that has supported the ASCOR development together with the PRI, the IIGCC, the AIGCC, and series. And they've engaged with sovereigns during the through various channels. There's been a public consultation open to everyone to provide feedback on the ASCOR, but we've also organized roundtables prior to the publication of the methodology to get feedback on both sides. As Tom said, there is this ongoing pilot project that the PRI is supporting in Australia that is yielding promising results. And so hopefully the plan is for the investor networks to take this forward and continue to expand the engagement, be them on a unilateral basis or a collaborative basis with sovereigns. But we as LSE, we provide the technical support for ASCOR, but we do not organize the engagement with the sovereigns. There is one more question for Tom and or Matthew: how to navigate engagement with sovereigns without being prescriptive and what they should or should not be doing. I would actually open this question to Víctor as well, because I think it'd be interesting to hear your perspective as well. Matt and Tom, if you could be very succinct, because I see that time is flying.
I'll go very quickly, Carmen. Just in the collaborative engagement, one, we work with a very solid principle that we ask all participants to sign up to, which is to recognize that sovereigns' ultimate responsibilities to the communities that they represent. So investors are really providing one input into policy-making processes in what is a complex field, and it is therefore offered in the kind of spirit of information about investor practice and capital market interests and expectations that can be incorporated into the thinking and design of their responses. Secondly, we seek to engage on the commitments that sovereigns have already made. Now, the qualifier on that is that that commitment includes the Paris Agreement and the ultimate goals of the Paris Agreement. These are commitments that they've made to the international community, but also ultimately to the market as well. So that does create a bit of space in terms of the engagement topics, but we are really seeking to engage on the commitments that have been made and therefore understanding the progress that's been made against that. And just finally on the last bit, Carmen, I'm sorry, just in terms of the government officials' response, I'd be very interested in Victor's views on this, but from our experience, both in Australia, but we've also done a little bit of early engagement with one or two other markets that are in the report that I mentioned. It's generally been very well received. But sovereigns are trying to navigate a complicated transition like the rest of us, and they are getting these questions organically through their own roadshows, and so therefore they're seeking information. They want to understand how capital markets are thinking about this, and they need private capital to help finance their transition. So policies that can help attract that information is therefore useful.
I'm going to stop you there, Tom. Sorry, Victor, I'm going to turn to you very quickly for a quick reaction.
No, perhaps prescriptive is a harsh word, but normally the investor community is part of the community. So the idea is to reach a middle point between the different opinions and to check if what they are looking for in the market is reasonable for the general governmental sector, and if there are good ideas, it's possible to implement. Why not? That's the idea.
Very good. And actually, you said it at the beginning, Victor, that after the issuance of the green bond, it was the engagement with investors that brought you to expand the sustainability, the themed label bond plan to other types of instruments in response to that type of conversation and engagement. And we said several times that the engagement should be done in a constructive spirit. Look, we are at time. This has been a very, very insightful conversation. And as usual, time flies when it's very interesting. I just wanted to very quickly to talk to you through the next steps. If I can manage to share the screen one more time. I've covered already some of the points through the Q&A session. So we will plan to continue. We intend to continue to update the country assessments annually. We will cover more countries, 70 this year and just over 100 next year. We will continue to provide analytical reports on ASCORs to really tease out some more information that could help inform those conversations. At some point, there might be room for pausing and take on all the learnings that we are marking as part of the engagement that we're doing, even including through this webinars. And we're really pleased to see that investor networks are willing to take this one level up and start organizing more collaborative engagement. So please join me in thanking Victoria, Barron, our wonderful co-chair of ASCOR, together with Adam Matthews, Esther Lowe from Amundi, and Claudia Goldmeyer from Colchester Global, Matt Graves, Víctor González, Tom Arup, and Barbara Oldani. And last but not least, I want to say thank you also to Nina, the lead research project manager behind ASCOR, who has to take all the credit for putting together with the team the framework and continuing to develop it. So we are planning our next webinar. Do please engage and let us know what are the topics that you would like us to cover. Until then, goodbye and thank you for staying with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.